Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Boss Economics World, your one-stop channel for in-depth discussions on geopolitics, financial markets, and governmental crisis management. In today's headline, we're going to break down Donald Trump's audacious yet controversial economic strategy as he paves his way toward the 2024 presidential election. Trump mesmerizingly defends his pit-stop strategy for American glory by pushing tariffs, promising growth, rebuilding domestic manufacturing, and throwing out some spicy economic moves about reshaping the Federal Reserve and immigration policy. Now, you know I don't hold back. Is this bold economic vision really poised to make America great again? Or just a high-speed train heading straight toward a financial train wreck? Let's dive into this boiling pot. First off, Trump's speech, as we heard, was loaded with his signature aggressive talking points: tariffs, trade wars, tweaking the Federal Reserve, and America First policies. You see, on the surface, this narrative sounds peachy. Who wouldn't want American jobs, American supremacy, and the U.S. manufacturing sector returning stronger than ever? It's a lovely soundbite, especially for people who think America's glory days lie in rebuilding obsolete institutions. What Trump doesn't talk about, though, are the deeper layers hidden behind his proposals. These are layers that economists, market experts, and even a moderate voter should be worried about, like inflation spikes, a surge in the national debt, and how U.S. allies or businesses might react negatively to these policies. Point 1. Tariffs won't save the day, but they'll charge you for sure. Now, rewind back to 2018 to 2019, Trump placed tariffs on China. What happened, though? Inflation, rising costs. American importers paid billions in tariffs while China pretty much shrugged it off. Remember, when you hike tariffs on imported goods, it's American businesses and consumers that bear the brunt. They don't send the bill to foreign manufacturers, they send it to you, the American buyer. Let's pause for a second here. If Trump imposes a 60% tariff on Chinese goods, as he proposes, the economic consequences could actually slap $200 billion onto American consumers and businesses through raised import prices. But that's just a fraction of what America spends. For context, in FY 2024, the U.S. government pulled in $4.9 trillion in revenue. So yeah, $200 billion from tariffs might sound like a lot until you realize it's unlikely to even dent future deficits or pay for the multi-trillion-dollar spending plans Trump promises. The debt clock will keep ticking. And speaking of debt, Trump's dismissal of the deficit is alarming. Is anyone else shaking their head when they hear that lackadaisical response about economic growth outpacing government debt? The United States is already staring down the barrel of a near $2 trillion annual deficit. Sure, Trump seems confident his implementation of tariffs and deficit-fueled fiscal expansion would fuel tremendous growth. But where's the data to back it up? There is none. Point 2. The inflation time bomb. Next up, inflation. Inflation is the boogeyman Trump loves to underplay. But let's not be too naive here. When you splurge massive public money with tax cuts, infrastructure programs, and tariffs that spike costs on major imports, inflation is no mere ghost story. Trump's critics have repeatedly warned of accelerated inflation, particularly if more direct interventions happen at the federal. For reference, U.S. inflation peaked at 9.1% in mid-2022 after the massive fiscal expansion and supply chain disruptions triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. As much as central banks tried to cool it down, inflationary pressures escalate with erratic policies. Let's peel back Trump's Fed comments. He suggests that, as president, he should have more influence on the Fed's decisions. This raises red flags, especially because interfering with the Fed runs the risk of undoing the delicate balance that keeps economic policy relatively independent from political maneuvering. His claim that it's simple to talk to the Fed chairman about rates shows a baffling misunderstanding of how monetary policy works. The Fed has been struggling to balance raising interest rates to curb inflation while trying not to tank the economy. A Trump-mandated lower interest rates, especially amid tax cuts and deficit-financed projects, would overheat an already simmering inflationary pot. How exactly Trump plans to avoid turning this inflationary heat into a national economic meltdown puzzles most analysts. Point 3. Debt-fueled economic growth on thin ice. Now let's talk about the real problem: the unsustainable debt cycle that balloons when Trump's economic overhaul meets reality. He boasts about reducing corporate taxes to 15% from 21% and deregulating industries while encouraging domestic production. It's a corporate dream, and frankly, Wall Street loves this part of the program. But the irony here can't be overlooked either. An artificial boost via deregulation and subsidies might generate short-term stock market rallies, but long-term, a ballooning deficit due to unmet tariff revenues, lower tax income, and heightened government spending for manufacturing subsidies will probably dwarf any benefits. By the way, let's dig into that deficit. Today, the projected interest payments on U.S. federal debt are staggering. By 2033, interest payments alone could sucker up roughly $1.4 trillion annually, consuming nearly 15% of the federal budget. And yet, instead of addressing this looming crisis, Trump is choosing to toss more fuel on the fire. It's as if you're lighting a bigger fire, expecting that fire will eat itself out. And guess what? The ordinary person pays for bigger fires in the form of high taxes down the line, reduced government services, or simmering inflation that leaves our wallets lighter and our wages stagnant. Now, some viewers might ask, but what about job creation? Trump claims that his tariffs and manufacturing incentives will be an American jobs machine. But herein lies the next fallacy, the misconception of reshoring. Point 4. Will companies really come back? There's no doubt Trump's plan to re-onshore industries pleases the blue-collar American worker. But here's where economics nudges us back into reality. Even if companies might be tempted by tax break lures or anti-China fervor, labor costs in the U.S. are significantly higher than in emerging markets, where they've outsourced manufacturing for decades. You're not likely to see an exodus of companies back into the U.S. because paying an American union worker 3 or 4 times what they would overseas just doesn't make financial sense. What Trump downplays or perhaps deliberately ignores is that automation, not tariffs, is the largest impediment to job creation. And for the companies that do come back, they'll likely use robotics and AI to mass-produce goods without the human factor Trump promises to protect. Moreover, Trump's immigration policies, highlighted during the campaign, introduce another wrench in his job growth fantasy. By raiding undocumented workers while introducing a restrictive immigration policy, Trump fails to account for the millions of low-skill laborers the U.S. economy depends on. While he talks about legal migration making up for job losses, the math just doesn't line up in the short to medium term. The agriculture, hospitality, and construction sectors would feel the brunt of these disruptions. Point 5. Foreign allies? What allies? Then there is the issue of America's increasingly strained relationships with traditional allies. Trump has hinted at tariffs on goods from traditional partners, including Europe and Japan. I couldn't help but chuckle at Trump's assumption that allies will gladly comply with these tariffs to continue doing business with the U.S. His economic nationalism doesn't sit as well in the markets as he suggests. We're already seeing countries like Mexico, Canada, and even partners in the EU pivot away from depending on Uncle Sam as they ink deals with emerging markets where tariffs and political uncertainty don't dominate the negotiation table. Does Trump really believe that this resurgence of isolationist protectionism will work in a global economy so tightly connected by supply chains that squeezing one end has ripple effects on the entire system? If anything, a 10 to 60% tariff blitzkrieg would only invite retaliatory tariffs, disrupt intertwined markets, and harm both U.S. businesses and consumers in the medium term. So let's recap Trump's ambitious yet deeply flawed ride. What's his game plan? Tax breaks, sky-high tariffs, bringing jobs back to America, controlling the Fed, and taking a sledgehammer to the deficit. However, behind the grandiose promises lies a shaky base. More plausible than tremendous growth is seeing inflation spike up, debt soar beyond unmanageable levels, businesses passing cost increases on to consumers, and long-term competitiveness eroding in a bid to hold onto outdated manufacturing models. Sure, you could say many voters might love Trump's rhetoric. But if you scratch beyond the surface, it's pretty clear bad policies may bring crowds and cheers temporarily, but misplaced economic ideals packaged as patriotism could unleash a decade of slow growth, higher interest rates, an eroded U.S. dollar, and an economy teetering on the edge of crisis. If I dare say it, Trump's playbook is a risky economic gamble.